War in the Middle East is escalating. What does the impending crisis between Iran and Israel mean for the world, for the Middle East, and indeed for South Africa? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, my name's Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. But increasingly, many of you have asked for a geopolitical look at some of the events happening in the world. SMWX is a baby of mine that I have been doing for a long time, and it is really about South African politics. But in my other life, I'm a lecturer at Wits University, and my subject is actually international relations. So I'm particularly interested in global politics too, and I thought I would try and bring that here to SMWX because I think we're at a very dangerous moment for the world. There are two wars raging in critical areas of the world. There are also wars happening in Africa, and let me know if you want me to address some of those in future episodes. But in particular, there is an unfolding crisis in the Middle East. There's also the Russia-Ukraine war, and there's a danger, it's probably still a relatively low probability that these two theaters actually end up merging. At the very least, those on either side of those wars seem to be increasingly escalating towards some form of conflict. So in the worst case scenario, this really could lead to significant war, unlike we have seen in our lifetimes. But even in some of the less worst case scenarios, we may confront a serious war in the Middle East, a regional war. I think we already have one, but an escalating one between two very big regional powers, Israel and Iran. And so what I want to do in this episode today is just help you understand what's going on, because there's a lot going on, but hopefully by the end of this video, you'll get a sense of exactly who the players are, who's on which side, and what the stakes of this are. And then I also want to speak about what could be happening in the future and what you should look out for in terms of what would constitute an escalation, particularly of the Middle East crisis. And then finally, I actually want to look at it from a South African perspective and what it could mean, because I think it has important implications for the coalition government. So let's start with the first section, and that is really just to speak about what has recently happened. Now, on the 10th of October, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, launched an unprecedented ballistic missile attack on Israel. This was unprecedented for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the sheer scale of the attack. There were somewhere between 180 and 200 ballistic missiles within that range, and that's a massive attack in terms of global proportions. What was important about this moment was that a number of the missiles penetrated Israeli air defenses, which up to that point many had thought were much stronger. And when Iranian missiles struck Israeli soil, that was an important indicator that Iran's missile capability, which has been upgrading for a long time now, has reached the point where they are able to successfully strike Israeli targets. And in particular, the Nevatim air base, which is a key air base of Israel, was struck. Of course, this is a concrete structure in some ways, so the extent of the damage is disputed between the different sides. Iran saying that they managed to strike aircraft, Israel saying that there wasn't any serious damage, but what we do know is that a series of missiles made it through onto that airbase. Now, in April of this year, there was a similar retaliatory strike from Iran in which they sent a series of drones and missiles and what they called dummy missiles, and most of those were shot down. But the significance of the April moment was that Iran in that retaliatory attack seemed to be gathering intelligence on Israeli air defenses. So the aim wasn't necessarily to strike Israel, but to assess whether Israeli air defenses were as impenetrable as they had been mooted to be. And that's why the October strike that we have just seen is important, because clearly Iranian military strategist had found a way to effectively try to send a message. And what the message was that we are capable of striking Israel, although mostly military targets were the subject of the attack. And any future strike could potentially be even worse, now that we know that Israel's air defenses were penetrated by Iran. Now, Israel has a very complex air defense system. There are actually 3 different systems. There's the Iron Dome system, there's the Arrow system, and there's the David Sling system. In a nutshell, what these are is when you launch a missile, a ground-based missile, into a foreign territory, there are what are called air defenses. And these are usually systems launched from the ground as well, or from various launching parts, which intercept these missiles as they are on their way to their targets. Now, of course, Israel has faced missile attacks from various places, largely short-range missile attacks, and that's largely what Iron Dome is about. But the 2 other long-range systems are in place, and Iran clearly found ways around these air defense systems. So that's why I think this is important for global politics at the moment. This is an unprecedented moment, a massive retaliatory strike by Iran, which actually reached Israeli soil. Now, in order to understand why that's further important, we therefore need to understand why did Iran send this retaliatory missile attack? What's the situation? And that's how we have to disentangle the situation in the Middle East right now, because you can understand it firstly largely as a conflict between Israel on the one hand, backed by the United States and Europe largely, and Iran, which has allies in Russia and to a lesser extent China, which also backs various forces within the Middle East which are opposed to the Israeli government and in some ways the Israeli state. But all of them are largely constellate around Iran. So let's take a look at who these different actors are. To the south of Israel, near Saudi Arabia, and you'll be able to see some of these maps as I talk, you have Yemen. And there you have a group called Ansarullah, or some people describe them as the Houthis. And they have, in a civil war in Yemen, largely been able to take control of key territory within Yemen. And they are opposed to Israel and a part of an alliance with Iran. And you'll see that since the war in Gaza, resulting in what the International Court of Justice has described, after South African lawyers made the case as at least a plausible case of genocide in Gaza, where more than 40,000 people have been horrifically killed, many of them civilians. We know that hospitals, orphanages, and schools, even some UN facilities have been targeted in an unprecedented air campaign in Gaza. But we'll come to that. Ever since that took place, Ansarullah, or the Houthis in Yemen, have launched retaliatory strikes, largely trying to shut down sea lanes in the Red Sea, because this is a key area for shipping, which is key further to the global economy. So one of Iran's partners, as it were, in opposing Israel is in Yemen. The second is called Hezbollah, which is part of the Lebanese government, but it is not the Lebanese government. It is a political and military movement from within Lebanon to the north of Israel. So you've got Houthis largely to the south. You've got Hezbollah to the north. We'll come on to more of this because the war is expanding into Lebanon, and that's a key theater of the war. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of who the players are. So you've got Israel on one hand, backed by the US and Europe. Then you've got Iran, and it backs various other forces within the Middle East. So you've got the Houthis, you've got Hezbollah. So that's two. So Israel is currently fighting a war, of course, internally, but then against several other forces in different places to its south, to its north. It's actually a 7-front war, but I'll explain why I say that later. Okay, so we've got those two actors. Now, you will maybe have heard that the most recent large-scale conflict in the Middle East was the war in Syria, which has simmered down somewhat now, and each side of that war now holds a certain amount of territory. But you've got the government of Bashar al-Assad and which is backed by Iran and Russia, fighting against various Islamic militant groups, ISIS being one of them, and then Turkey is also involved. But basically and Israel, of course, has an interest in that Syrian conflict as well. And there have been Israeli airstrikes in Syria. So there's a certain Iran-linked movement in Syria, which is also tied to Iran. You've got a resistance in Iraq, because the Iraq conflict, although the US has withdrawn, has continued to rumble on. And there are groups in Iraq also tied to Iran, which are opposed to Israel. So you can see that Israel has used the moment after the October 7th attacks, which I'll get onto, not only to respond to Hamas, which is yet another internal opponent of Israel in Gaza, used this moment of admittedly terrible attacks, what Mehdi Hassan has described as war crimes on October the 7th, to launch a much more wide-scale assault on Gaza. But then also Israel views this as an opportunity to fundamentally remake the Middle East and actually deal a blow to all of those Iran-linked, to some extent, opposition or resistance movements in one go. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems to see this as an opportunity for a regional war in which Israel actually deals a blow to Hezbollah, to Houthis in Yemen, to resistance movements in Syria and Iraq. And then let's finally come to the big fish, as it were, which is Iran, which is the other dominant regional power, right? So as you can see on the map, you've got Israel, then you've got Syria, Iraq, and then Iran in a line, and Iran is a key regional player. So when we take a step back and we think about what's happening in the Middle East right now, we've got Israel confronting, to various degrees, Hamas in Gaza, unleashing untold violence and destruction also on the West Bank, which is another part of Palestine, Palestinian territory. We've got Hezbollah in Lebanon. We've got Houthis in Yemen to the south. We've got, to the east of Israel, we've got Syria and then also Iraq. So that's 6. And then Iran is the 7th. So we actually have something that is approximating a 7-front war, with each of those 7 fronts at different stages of conflict. Now, the reason why this moment is particularly important, like I said, and why I started with the missile attack, is that Iran has now joined this conflict proper. Before, it was a conflict between groups, some rebel groups, some militant groups, some resistance formations that are linked to Iran or backed by Iran. But now the two regional powers are actually exchanging blows. And that should give us all pause, because when Israel and Iran enter into conflict, that's going to be a very different conflict, right? The people of Gaza are largely defenseless, right? They are, even if they wished to, they are unable to mount a massive military campaign against Israel. Even Hezbollah to the north, which is a much more sophisticated fighting force than, for example, Hamas, is still kind of a paramilitary non-state actor, right? But Iran is a fully equipped state, which has serious capabilities that actually exceeded probably many expectations with that strike. And so when Iran and Israel come to conflict, we're talking about serious interstate war, right? So the question then becomes, why did Iran launch this strike against Israel? Why now? Israel has always been opposed to Iran and vice versa. So why now? Well, of course, as I say, the ongoing war in Gaza, which Iran, South Africa, and many others describe as a genocide at this point, has shocked and just outraged much of the world, at least the non-Western world. And in some ways, this has united many forces and internal to Iran, which are opposed to Israel, around a response. But it's not just that. It's that Israel itself has undertaken a number of actions in Iran, to which Iran actually hasn't fully responded until now, except for the April drone and missile attack that I mentioned. The first is, you may remember that there have been a number of assassinations on Iranian officials. So nuclear scientists. During the Trump administration, there was an assassination on an Iranian general, which you may remember, General Soleimani. And more recently, at the inauguration of the new Iranian Prime Minister, Pezeshkian, the political leader of Hamas, who was an invited guest to Iran, was assassinated in Iran. This is Mr. Haniyeh. So one of Hamas's key political leaders went to Iran for a presidential inauguration event, and he was actually murdered in his guest house. And Israel took responsibility for that. So within Iran, there have been a number of assassinations and attempts to strike various leaders linked to either the Iranian government or parties or actors linked to Iran. So after Haniyeh was assassinated, many people thought that Iran would actually retaliate, but it didn't. It took a while and it took some time. What finally sparked the Iranian response was Israel's decision not only to launch its bombing campaign in Gaza, but in Lebanon, to the north, where Hezbollah is. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. So recently, you may have seen that in addition to the campaign in Gaza, Israel has turned north and has started bombing Lebanon, and a number of civilians have been killed in this campaign. And in particular, Israel has been targeting, in addition to hitting civilians, the leadership of Hezbollah. It assassinated Hezbollah's leader, longtime leader, Nasrallah, and virtually all of its high command in a series of bombing campaigns. And also there was that pager attack where people's pagers and phones exploded basically into their faces. So Israel has in some ways tried to decapitate the leadership of Hezbollah. And the reason I say this is you need to think about the wider context. It seems that Israel is intent on trying to weaken each and every one of those of its foes around it. Now, Hezbollah is, of course, backed by and linked to Iran. And so when you assassinate the leader of one of those key movements linked to Iran, Iran finally decided it was going to respond militarily, even though it had actually shown some restraint up to that point, given the assassinations that had taken place within Iran, etc. So that's what's currently happening, and that's roughly where we are in this conflict. The Yemeni-Israel theater is, Yemen is still being bombed, and there are still airstrikes on Yemen, but largely Ansar Allah / the Houthis have been able to pretty much restrain Red Sea shipping lanes. There's not a lot of shipping going on there right now. Of course, there's been an attempt to annihilate Hamas in Gaza, which I wouldn't say has actually been a particular success. Of course, Gaza itself has basically been turned into rubble now, but Hamas is still operating, and it has not been defeated, which was the stated Israeli war aim. In Lebanon, in addition to the air campaign, there was also a ground invasion of Lebanon. And that ground invasion at present seems to have largely just halted around the borders because, as I say, Hezbollah is quite a serious fighting force, and it's terrain that they know and understand. So they don't have the same kind of air power as Israel, but when it comes to ground combat, it seems that Hezbollah is resisting any serious incursions into Lebanese territory. So for now, what we have is a serious civilian death toll, but not much of a change in the balance of power in the Middle East. But all that could be set to change depending on what goes forward and what happens from here. And so now I want to talk about the future and what could happen and what could escalate this into a deeper and a larger regional war. So Israel has vowed to retaliate to the Iranian airstrike. And in doing so, there are various potential options, and there are various retaliations to those options that Iran also has at its disposal. So I want to take you through those so that you can think through what could be happening in the next few weeks, maybe even days from here. So Israel has a number of options that it has spoken about potentially striking in Iran. The first is it could strike the Israeli nuclear program. Now, Iran does not have nuclear weapons, but it is on the brink of being able to have nuclear weapons. In other words, it knows how to have nuclear weapons, it just hasn't decided to build them. So Israel could strike these facilities, which are capable of ultimately taking Iran on past the nuclear threshold and actually being a nuclear weapon state. By the way, Israel is a nuclear weapon state. So Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran is on the brink of getting nuclear weapons, but for many decades now, there has been this kind of brinkmanship where the US has tried to bring Iran into a nuclear deal. The US then pulled out of that deal. It was called the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And basically, there's been this holding maneuver where Iran has not fully got nuclear weapons, but they have left themselves with the capability of being able to get them. So one thing that Israel could try to do is strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, the problem with that option is that, as far as I understand, and there are, I think, 5 different major nuclear facilities, they're spread out over a very large territory, but also a lot of them are underground because Iran has been planning for this potential strike, or has obviously known that either the US or Israel may strike at any given time. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, Israel will just launch airstrikes against these facilities. That's not an easy thing to do, right? So there's that. Now, it seems that the US is not in support of a strike on the Iranian nuclear program. Biden has said he thinks that would be a step too far, or intimated that. And so that would be a very serious option, because remember that a lot of what Israel does is through the backing of the United States militarily and economically. And so it has to try and keep the US on side. Although the US basically has an unprecedented relationship with Israel whereby it basically supports it no matter what. So there's the option of the nuclear facilities, and former Israeli, I think President or Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said he thinks this should be what Israel does. So there are serious policymakers in Israel advocating for this. The second option is striking Iranian oil facilities. Iran is one of the world's biggest oil producers. I think it's like the fourth biggest oil producers. And on its west coast, there are really important there's really important oil infrastructure. Now, again, this is where things get dicey, because if Iranian oil facilities get hit, Iran has already sent the message that they are capable, as we said, of landing retaliatory strikes in Israel. So whether they go for the nuclear facilities or the oil facilities, Iran may respond in turn. But if Iranian oil facilities are hit, then Iran has already said they are going to go for oil facilities linked to Israel and the US in other Middle Eastern countries, right? So that could be Saudi, Qatari, any other oil fields. And we know that there are US military bases in some of these territories. So if Iran's oil facilities get hit, then it has vowed that it will respond and retaliate. And if its missiles can make it through Israeli air defenses, they can certainly hit the oil fields. So that will launch an economic crisis. And if you thought inflation was bad before, a huge crisis in world oil supply will be a serious economic crisis. And so we could have a situation in which, if this conflict escalates towards oil infrastructure, all kinds of economic havoc could be unleashed, both on the US and the West and Iran and its supporters. And for South Africa, I just take a step back as an oil importer. That could be really bad for our economy if there's this all-out war over oil infrastructure in the Middle East, because things will get extremely expensive, or there'll be shortages potentially. So there's that. The third option is that we know that Israel has a strategy of attacking leadership and assassinations. So the other thing they could do is they could attack regime centers of the Islamic Republic. They could try to assassinate leaders of Iran. Maybe senior leaders of Iran, whether we're talking foreign ministers or prime ministers, or maybe even the supreme leader of Iran, so-called Ayatollah Khomeini. So that's another option, and maybe one that Israel is probably is in keeping with the way that Israel has attacked Hezbollah, etc. Or there could be some combination. But what we do know is that Israel has said that they intend to retaliate. So where do we find ourselves currently in the world right now? We find ourselves in a situation where Iran has, for the first time, successfully struck Israeli territory and demonstrated its capacity to at least unleash damage on Israel if it goes further than the October 10th strike. Whereas Israel has vowed to retaliate, and any one of those retaliations, particularly if they hit the nuclear facilities or oil facilities, could lead to much more serious Iranian retaliations, and then a cycle of escalation could continue back and forth. No matter what happens, there are a couple of very important issues that flow from this. Iran may be forced into the nuclear posture, or may be forced to get nuclear weapons now that it feels that its sovereignty is being threatened by any strike. So if Israel strikes, that may embolden those in Iran who want nuclear weapons to say, well, that's exactly, the deterrence value is obvious now, to get them. So we may have a new nuclear weapon state in the world. We've spoken about the oil and economic consequences. The other, of course, is if the United States is brought further and further into the war, as, of course, Israel's economy, which has suffered over the last year or year and a half, if Israel succeeds in bringing the United States, which has massive military capacity, into this conflict, then again, you see it expanding not just in terms of the regional powers, but then having more of a global context, to the extent that Europe and the United States may be more active participants in aggression against Iran and Iranian responses, which would then mean that Russia, which is one of Iran's key allies, may be dragged in to assist Iran in in its campaign. And so you do see, I still think it's a bit unlikely, and I think people are getting a bit carried away with themselves saying World War III is about to break out, but that's the trajectory of how it would break out, largely, is that the US would be brought in, and then Iran would bring Russia in. And of course, there is another war happening in the world at the moment, which is between Russia and Ukraine, right? And on that side, Iran and Russia stand on one side. The US and the EU and Europe are on another side. And so what you don't want to see is things happening in the Middle East then affecting how things happen in Ukraine and Russia, because then you really do have something that looks like a more global conflict. So, for example, if the US helps Israel to strike Iran, then does Russia retaliate in Ukraine? And then does Europe retaliate towards Russia, etc.? It seems that Russia is, even though it's been a very long war and a war of attrition, which really inches forward, Russia is in the driver's seat at the moment in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that's another sign that there's just a wider conflict in the world between Western powers, who have largely been unilateral in their power up until this point, and China, Russia, Iran slowly starting to push back against Western actions as well. So we're in an interesting time in the world, and we're in an interesting time in the Middle East, and the way that Israel responds to this Iranian strike will be crucial for the future going forward. So I hope that's helped you to understand the conflict to some extent. Of course, I mentioned in passing, but it's worth noting that Hamas's actions on October 7th were key to Israel's response. In other words, various war crimes were committed. I think about 1,000 or over 1,000 Israelis were killed. People at music festivals, and actually Palestinians also were killed in Hamas's attack on October the 7th of Israel. And I think most people in the world have condemned that. But the problem is that the severity of Israel's response was not in proportion. And the killing of 40,000 people has then opened questions about whether this is truly about defeating Hamas, or whether this is about using the fear of civilian deaths to send a political message. And that's what the South African government has said in its case before the ICJ, and that's what many observers inside the US, even inside Israel, inside Europe, have also said, that Israeli actions have just gone beyond the bounds of what is tolerable in war. That's not to justify anything that's happened specifically to Israeli civilians, but it's to say that the response to October 7th has been so egregious that it has now precipitated, in some ways, greater unity in the Middle East than we have ever seen, and now brought us to this place of a serious possible conflagration. And I stop there to say that you may have seen that Iranian officials have been recently seen in Saudi Arabia. It's interesting to note that Iran and Saudi Arabia are both invitees to BRICS. And the two have not always been friends because of internal rivalries, largely to do with geopolitics and Islam itself. But you can see why Iran would be going to Saudi Arabia to say, if this breaks out, Saudi Arabia is probably saying to Iran, like, what is the exposure of our infrastructure here? But we've also seen greater moves towards unity in the Middle East. Before this, Israel and Saudi Arabia in the Abraham Accords were coming closer together. Now that seems to have broken apart, and we're starting to see moves between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so there's a wider question about who will ally with whom within the region. Will Iran be able to secure greater allyship with Gulf states, or will Israel be able to do that? And Israel's actions in Gaza have estranged it from Saudi Arabia, for example, to say nothing of Lebanon. And then there are wider questions about whether a place like Jordan, which has largely supported the US and stayed relatively silent, what will happen there. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch, and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. We could go on for hours about this, but I want to come back to the South African point because the government of national unity, so-called, has to have a foreign policy. And I think a regional war in the Middle East would basically split the government down the middle. Because you have the ANC on one hand, which has largely been at least pro the Palestinian cause and has been very critical of Israel's actions in the Middle East on the one hand. And then you've got the DA, the Patriotic Alliance, the IFP, the Freedom Front Plus, who are all in the same government, but who are very vocal supporters of Israel. And so if a regional war breaks out and each country will have to at least have a position on that war, it's not clear what the South African government's position would be. And previous policies of the government have been followed as regards Palestine and Israel, but a new development would then have to be responded to. And I'm not sure what that cabinet meeting would look like where South Africa formulates its foreign policy. The ANC has the foreign ministry. Minister Lamola is an ANC minister. But it's clear that a regional war would cause at least tension and pose a serious threat to South Africa's foreign policy. Throw on top of that South Africa is a key player within BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and various other new invitees, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. BRICS is going to be going to a summit at the end of October. So what we could see, and this is why the timing of all this matters, is I wonder what will be happening by the time we get to the BRICS summit. Will Israel have responded? And if they respond close to the BRICS summit, then all of these countries are going to be meeting and all of these world leaders are going to be meeting at a time when this war is really reaching a new level. Or will they wait for after the BRICS summit? Because the BRICS summit, I think, is going to discuss many of these geopolitical questions, and the Middle Eastern question will be central because many of the BRICS states feel that it's time for a slightly more equal world order in which their voices are heard around the table of the Security Council, around the table of world economic institutions, with more fervor and more force. Now, what role will South Africa play in all of this? What will it be saying at that BRICS summit? Will it have a very clear foreign policy on this, or will the divisions within the government weaken and water down its foreign policy to the extent that it won't be able to move either way? In some ways, that makes sense because South Africa is both an ally to Western nations in some ways and an ally to China and Russia in other ways. So we're kind of playing both sides. But for how long will we be able to play both sides if a regional war breaks out? Certainly a global conflict. So it's interesting times for South African foreign policy, and I'll be very interested in what the coalition government does and how it approaches this geopolitical crisis. So I hope that's given you some insight into what's happening in the Middle East. It'll be interesting to watch. If you enjoyed this video, we're experimenting with some more global content. Let me know down in the comments and we will continue to follow this issue. Of course, this is a platform for dialogue, debate, and discussion. No one agrees on domestic politics, let alone global politics. So if you agree or disagree, let me know down in the comments. If you think there's anything I've missed or any nuances that need to be captured, then let's continue down in the comments below. And it's an unfolding event and an unfolding conversation. So we'll continue to follow it. Like, share, subscribe, and keep it locked on SMWX. Aye.